joining us. Many new joiners today, as I can see you coming through, as well as very many people from our regular cohort. Welcome to everyone. As you arrive, remember to switch your video off and put yourself on mute until you ask a question. Note to all, I will be recording this webinar, so I hope that's okay with everyone. I'm Nicola Brooks, and welcome to our Women in Leadership for Finance webinar. Now, this is the second in the series of 3 on the subject of resilience during transition. Last time we heard from CFO Hayley Wardle and Amanda Reynolds, who's a professional coach of Blend Limited. They shared with us their experiences of resilience. This was a fantastic session, a mix of real-life examples and of bouncing back from setbacks, as well as the theory and some practical advice on career resilience. So if you missed it, I'm happy to share the recording. Just message me. Our regular members will notice today that there's someone missing. My partner in crime, Zoe Pietchark, unfortunately can't make the webinar today. We do, however, have an amazing stand-in. Our guest host today is Caroline Owusu-Bennoah, who is Director of Finance and Deputy Chief Executive at the Royal National Orthopaedic Hospital in Stanmore. Caroline was one of our speakers at our very first webinar in July 2020, along with another female CFO, Dawn Scrayfield. So back in the day, our very first webinar, we had no idea how it was going to go at all. And I think we had about 25 people coming to it. As it turned out, it was very successful, hence why we've asked Caroline back as a co-host today. At that time, Caroline was reasonably new into her Director of Finance role and shared with us her career journey, some of the challenges and setbacks she had faced and the support network that she'd cultivated, as well as what she'd done herself to increase her exposure and to support others. What stood out about that webinar, apart from how nervous we all were, was Caroline's openness and how down-to-earth and relatable she is and how relevant her experience was to our network. That first webinar shaped much of our earlier sessions and led to dedicated webinars on networking and men as allies, where we actually featured one of Caroline's mentors, David Ragg. Another reason for choosing Caroline for today's session is that she already knows our speaker, Jazz. So we felt that a sofa-type chat with Jazz and Caroline together would work really well, where there's already some common ground and chemistry. So in a moment, I'll hand over to Caroline to introduce us to Jazz. But I just wanted to say a bit more about why I invited/stalked Jazz to join us for this webinar. When we started the series of 3 sessions on resilience during transition, I was really insistent that we hear from Jazz Thind. Jazz's experience will inspire and embolden many of our network during the challenges that we face in the NHS at the moment, specifically around trust mergers, ICB creation, and all the uncertainty that that is causing. And that means that there are potentially fewer CFO opportunities, and then the knock-on effect that can have when women are already disproportionately represented in senior levels. Jazz's experience brings to the fore transferable skills, experience, potential, and how to make that work for you in the face of shrinking opportunities. Anyway, I will stop banging on in a moment, but please do chime in and ask questions on your chat function as well during the session, or by raising your hand. As well as Caroline and I asking questions, but please do get involved and ask what you want to ask. It'd be great to have some questions coming through live. So thank you so much, Caroline and Jazz, for joining us today. And I'll hand you over to Caroline now to introduce Jazz.
Thank you, Nicola. That was quite a grand introduction. I don't know that I'm as grand as that. She makes up. I'm just a lowly CFO and Deputy Chief Exec at RNOH, nothing more. Nicola makes me sound like this amazing woman. However, I remember our first webinar, and I do remember how it was and the number of people who came and the conversations we had. It was very rich. and I thought it was a very, very good webinar. And I'm very impressed to see that we have 88 people on the line today. It's an honor to have this chat with somebody that I've admired for a very long time. I worked for Jazz when I was a trainee back in the day, and I promised that I wouldn't tell you the year because you might think we are quite old, and we really aren't. But yeah, there you go. So I worked for Jazz then, and at that time I thought, oh wow, this is an amazing lady. She worked in the finance team, and she was one of those people that you looked up to, you know, and I always looked up to her. And I remember before I finished the scheme, getting a job offer, and she had a vacancy herself, which I was helping cover. And I had a conversation with her, and she said, I can't see why you wouldn't go for that role. And I thought, that's quite selfless. Somebody would have said, you're not ready, Caroline, just stay here and cover this vacancy for me. But no, she was, that's the kind of person we're going to hear from. And I learned so much from her, and her manner, and just the way she goes about things is just amazing. Breath of fresh air is what I'd call it. And so I've known Jazz for a very long time. We've become friends. When this job came along, I think I spoke to her about it as well. And before she went for the role she's currently in, which is the CFO for Imperial, very, very big organization, I sort of had a conversation with her, and I said, my only fear, Jazz, is if you went there, you probably never go back to mental health because she originally went there as a comment. So it's an honor to really have this conversation with Jazz. I'll hand over to Jazz so she can sort of give you a brief synopsis of her career history and a bit about herself, and hear it from her, because I can only tell you the bits I see. She might have something more to add. I'm sure she does. So Jazz, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Caroline. Wow, that was glowing. I was sitting here thinking, is she talking about me? Is she talking about somebody else? But yeah, we've known each other now for almost nearly 30 years, I think, in the NHS, or 20 years at least. So yeah, it's been a privilege to know Caroline, because actually she's one of those people that is so down to earth and grounded. Whenever I had a sort of a dilemma or wanted to talk to somebody about it, I would pick the phone up and say, can I have a quick conversation with you about something? Because you need people like that around you, I think, as you start to think about what it is you want to do and what you want to achieve, and some of the opportunities that present themselves. And it's great to have somebody that you can use as a sounding board. So I'll always be grateful for Caroline. I'm sure I'll be ringing her again about other things in the future. So that friendship is there for a lifetime, I think. So a little bit about myself. I call myself an NHS lifer. So when I left university, I did a small stint in retail. I worked for what is now HMRC equivalent. I was working in the bailiffs team. I worked in VAT registration, so all the fun things that you do in the tax offices. And then I got an opportunity to join the NHS when the provider commissioner split was first established. Now we're talking back in 1993, so you're really going to know my age by now. And it was a data entry role. So all I really needed to do was sit down at a desk every single day and do data entry, setting up account codes, things that I thought, what are these things I'm establishing? I have no idea what the value of this is, but I would have reams and reams of paper sent to me, and I would just put data entry in every single day. But obviously that's not where I stayed. And that's probably a bit about the people I work for. So a bit like Caroline was saying, you know, people gave me opportunities back in those days to say, actually, do you want to do a bit of this? Do you want to do a bit of that? And it wasn't so formalized either. I think it was just a bit of a, actually, here's an opportunity, who's interested, who wants to do it? And then you sort of stepped into that role. I'm not saying that was the ideal way of doing it, but I think it presented me with the opportunities that I got in those days. So slowly but surely I progressed across the breadth of finance functions, actually. So I did most of the things that everybody probably knows about. I did AP, I did a bit of payroll, I did debt, I did fixed asset management, I did financial accounts, I did financial management. So when people say to me something, I say, I've done that, I know what you're talking about. And I know the challenges, and I know some of the opportunities, you know, so it's great to be able to actually use that knowledge and experience to help guide people, because I think sometimes you can come at a senior level without understanding some of the stuff that sits operationally with people. So I always feel that's an asset rather than a hindrance, and I hope people take that in that way when I talk to them about it. Yes, so slowly but surely, I got my first finance director role in 2015, 2016, having worked up through every single grade, because that's the way my brain worked. I thought I had to acquire knowledge and I had to step through every single banding in order to assure myself that I was ready to take the next step. And I think that is probably a fallacy, really. I think it's very much about an individual's approach. And I know some really great people that, you know, I now say to, don't worry about going through every single grade, because it's about your talent, and actually you can leapfrog up. You don't need to do the things the way I did them. But that was my journey and I gained a lot from it. I had a great boss who was my finance director, who was going to move on to be chief executive, who then said to me, actually, why don't you put yourself forward for this role? And I was still in the space of, what, me? I can't do an FD role. I'm very happy being deputy. I'll do a good job for anybody that comes in. But I couldn't put myself above the parapet. It was just my own inhibitions, I think, that led to that. But through suitable encouragement, sending me on a CFO development course with, I think it was Deloitte in those days, where for a week we went through a role play, skills, abilities, gravitas, all the things that made me realise being a CFO isn't about your technical skills, actually. It's about what you bring to the party. It's about you as an individual. It's about your values. It's about your impact. It's about how you present yourself that actually gets you where you need to get to. And these things for me were very, very alien, but actually very thought-provoking when I came out of that course, to think, actually, if I'm going to do that, this is what I've got to be aware of. And I'm no longer the person just worried about the numbers. Not that we should ever be as finance individuals. We should always worry about our patients, our clinical services, the quality of care we provide. But, you know, you sort of revert to form, don't you? You become an accountant because that's what you are. But as a CFO, you've got to be broader than that. You know, you've got to think about the whole agenda of the organisation, and quality is just as much my responsibility as it is a medical director's responsibility. So I think being a finance director in an organisation I had worked in for at least 15 to 20 years on and off, I was in a comfortable space because I knew the executive really well. I knew the systems and processes, and what I was stepping into was board level output. So that was my challenge. That was my development, not having to learn about the organisation, not having to learn about services. I understood the money. And so I was comfortable, I suppose, ultimately to say that's one small step and I can cope with that. I think the bigger change for me was when I got the opportunity to come and work at Imperial. So now I was in a new organisation, in a sector I'd never worked in, with an executive team I did not know, a chief exec I'd never met, NEDs I needed to understand, and the challenges of the organisation. So I suppose for me in my transition, that is what I would say is a real new thing for me versus what I did in Oxley's, where I had probably 80% of the things in my head already, and it was about the 20%. It was very much about 20/80 here, the reverse, because those other things were very, very important. And I'm hoping 2 years later, I'm sort of getting to grips with all of that, and people do like me because I'm still here. Sorry, that's a bit longer than I envisaged, Nicola, Caroline, but hopefully that gave a bit of a flavour.
Thank you. I've got a question just to kick off. Caroline, is it okay if I just jump in? Yeah. So what do you think, is it easier to get promoted or to go into the CFO role where you're reinventing yourself, like kind of like what you did at Imperial, or to be promoted within an organisation that you know already? Because you gave the example there of what was new to you at Oxley's. You knew the place, you knew the people, you knew the financial regime that they work within. It was really just sort of, you know, elevating that level and having more of a board presence. Whereas at Imperial, it was all new there. What did you find the most difficult or most challenging?
I think it's different challenges in both of those roles. So for my Oxley's role, I suppose the challenge for me was, how was I going to reinvent myself in an organisation that knew me inside out? You know, so I was going into an interview process where I knew the board members, I knew the executives. So I was thinking, what can I bring to this organisation that's going to add more value than I've added already? And that was hard, actually, because what they're expecting you to do, what I thought they were expecting me to do, was almost think outside the box and say, what's going to be different when Jazz is FD of this organisation compared to a deputy reporting into somebody else's vision, somebody else's aspirations for the organisation. So what am I going to do differently? So that was quite hard, actually, thinking through that, answering those questions in that way, because that's what I needed to really be clear about. I think coming to Imperial, given it was a brand new organisation, nobody knew me from Adam or Eve, or a better word. So I was an unknown entity, an unknown quantity. And in a way, I think whatever I said, they had to believe that what I was saying was authentic, because they didn't have an experience of my track record. I mean, they probably could have done some due diligence on me and talked to people. But ultimately, I was going to be a new face on this new patch. And I suppose what I really wanted to come out of the interview process was for them to know about me as an individual, and understand my values and whether they worked with the organisation. So I think we'll probably pick this up later, maybe as part of the conversation. When you move into a finance director role, as CFO role, the biggest thing I think you have to accept is you choose the right organisation. It is so important that I've seen a couple of really good colleagues, really talented individuals who got their first opportunity to be finance directors, and the first opportunity is the one they went for and got. And actually, because I think with hindsight, it wasn't the right organisation, it wasn't supporting them in what they wanted to achieve, to their detriment, I think, and I really felt for them that they had ended up in a situation where they had to really think about, do I want to stay here or do I want to leave and go and do something different? And I suppose I was very privileged that when I became finance director at Oxley's, given my experience of the organisation and my relationships with people, I knew that actually all of that was fine. I didn't need to worry about those relationships. I understood them. I knew what conversations I could have. I knew what lobbying I needed to do outside of meetings. Whereas when you walk into a new organisation, there's a very steep learning curve about going around and trying to understand once how the organisation's structured, who are the people, what are their values, what makes them tick. So you want to get the best out of them, just like they want to get the best out of you. So I think there are different challenges, Nicola, about how you invent yourself in each organisation. And sometimes I think it can be harder reinventing yourself in an organisation compared to the one that you don't know, because you are an unknown quantity and you can make your mark on day one versus something that you've been in for a long time. Hopefully that answers the question in terms of what you were trying to get out of that.
That's I'd agree with that, Jazz. That's some of that, is reinventing yourself in a new organisation. Trying to show them what you really bring can be quite challenging, isn't it? Because you really yourself and you know what you're capable of, but people only see a fraction of you because they've only just met you, and that can be quite challenging. So I was wondering, what concerns did you have about, because you moved sector, didn't you? You went from mental health into an acute provider, and I'm just wondering what were the major concerns you had, niggling at you before you made the move? I'm sure you talked to me about some of them, but it would be lovely for this audience to hear as well.
Yeah, so you're right, Caroline. I mean, Oxley's is a small organisation relative to others, provided mental health and community services, covered quite big geography actually, all the way down from Dover, all the way up to Crystal Palace in terms of the provision of service, but fairly small in terms of turnover. I think, so I suppose for me, the biggest thing about coming to Imperial was, and in my probably head, if I look back and think about it properly, if I was going to change organisations, I probably would have gone for the same kind of organisation, but a slightly bigger one, because it was about size and geography. And if I was going to change sectors, it probably would have been a smaller organisation that I thought, actually, yes, I can make a difference because I can understand it quickly and get on top of it. And I set myself an aspiration. So I joined Imperial on a secondment in January 20. I think it was the 2nd of January, actually. And before I knew it, the pandemic came along. So when I joined, I had this aspiration in my head about my induction program and what was I going to do, where I was going to go, and try and understand the services, the portfolio. Because to be fair, Imperial is not a small organisation. We're talking about £1.4 billion organisation. Would me, little old Jazz, as I would have said to myself, ever thought that she'd get to Imperial after Oxley's? No, it was not even in my thinking. It wasn't in my horizons at all. Because I would have done what I had done throughout my career, which is done small mini steps towards something big rather than going leap forward, you can do this. So I think the challenge for me coming into a new geography, so I left South East London, a geography and ICS I knew really well, came to North West London, which I then realised was one of the most financially challenged sectors in London. You know, we are one of the biggest organisations in the sector. So in terms of size, service provision, complexity, we're a very, very key system player. There are a number of other acute organisations in the sector. There's also mental health, community, primary care. So actually, as a geography, it had a lot in it that I had not really worked in terms of, I'd only worked in a mental health trust, and we were the only mental health trust in South East London. With SLAM, we always saw them as a competitor and thought actually we're not in their league. So although they were there, they weren't really my primary focus. But when you come to an organisation like this, and there's a whole research agenda, things that I had not really been involved in, didn't understand. My biggest thing for myself was within the first 3 months of getting here, I've got to know this organisation inside out. If I don't, I failed. So I set myself a target that I probably was never going to achieve. And then when March came along and the pandemic hit, obviously everything stopped. So I suppose the one thing that I've been challenging myself with over the last 2 years is the opportunities to go out and see the services, meet colleagues, have conversations, understand what it is that we do, how do we provide care, all of that got put on the back burner. And it's only now, very recently, with some of the relaxations that we've had in the community and in the trust, that I've actually had the opportunity to go out and do some more board visits now to services and have those conversations. So I think that's the one thing that's been quite challenging, not just the fact that it's a new organisation, a new geography, the opportunity to learn about the organisation got scuppered by the pandemic. And I've been sort of catching up ever since then, only now really getting to the point of actually trying to go out and meet people. Because I think that's so important that you do understand, you know, the patients you're trying to serve, the services that you're providing, how it all works, the efficiency of the organisation, the quality of care you're providing, which goes back to a broad agenda. You can't just be pigeonholed into being a finance director or a CFO. You have a responsibility to think about other things, and you only get to learn about that through conversation.
That's really, really, really helpful, Jazz. Before I bring Nicola in, because I can see she's just poised to ask a question. She's got a few questions to ask. I'm hogging the line, Nicola. Wait your turn. I think you're right, Jazz, about knowing the business, isn't it? And I tell my finance colleagues here, there is no point accounting for something you know nothing about, because what are you doing? And knowing the business is key. And I've always, and perhaps I don't know whether it's a function of how I got trained, I've always enjoyed being out in the services and always understanding pathways. So that's really, 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 it hits home. And I think it's important that as finance boards, we probably need to do a lot to know the business. And when you start knowing the business, it becomes easier, isn't it? When you become more senior, because you sort of get the pathways, isn't it?
Yeah, no, I was just going to say that is so true, Caroline. So ever since I've been here, when I used to be at Oxley's as well, I would say to my teams, you need to spend a day in the service. Every single month, you need to go out. If you need help and support to get that organised, just say, but it's so invaluable. And the only reason I say that, when I was a very, very junior finance board, looking after capital, I had the opportunity to go and visit one of our community sites. And actually, when they then talked about their capital programme, I could really see why they needed the improvements made, because I had seen the circumstances and the environment within which they were operating. So things start to make sense, because the money doesn't work in isolation. The money is there to add value to what we provide. isn't it? At the end of the day, patient care is a fundamental thing that we're here to do. We're all patients of the system. I'm sure we've got friends, relatives, and even ourselves access services. So actually going out and doing that thing, I think, is the most invaluable thing as a finance corporate person you could do, because there's a risk that you could come to work and just stay at your desk every single day and not have the vision or look outside of what you are there to do. And that's where I'm saying it's not about just CFOs understanding the business of the organisation, it's everybody understanding the business of the organisation. In whatever way that we can do that, we should be liberating people to go out into our organisation and learn about it.
Thanks, Jazz. Nicola.
Thank you. Sorry, Caroline, you could tell I was keen to jump in. Yeah, I was going to bring in a couple of questions actually from the floor, the virtual floor. Nicola Peters asked a really good question. Also, so did Helen. I'm just reading Adrian's as well. But Nicola, do you want to ask? I don't know if you want to put your video on and unmute yourself and ask the question directly to Jazz.
Hi Jazz, I'm Nicola Peters. I'd be interested to know how you found the transition at senior level when you come into an organisation, certainly when you're moving sectors, and people are looking at you for an answer to a question and you don't necessarily have the background to be able to give an informed answer. How do you sort of show that vulnerability? How do you sort of cover that off without, I find it a struggle to admit I don't know the answer, and I was just wondering how you dealt with that.
That's a really great question, Nicola, so thank you for asking it. I think when people ask a question, mainly they're looking for you for financial advice, because they see you as a CFO, you should understand the money, you should be able to respond to it. But sometimes those questions are broader than that. And in my career, the one thing I've never ever tried to do is blag my way through things. If I don't know it, I don't know it. And that could be in a board meeting, it could be in a board subcommittee meeting, it could be an exec meeting, it could be a conversation with a finance colleague. I have to say, actually, I don't know that, but I will go and find out. Or I will go and do the research I need to do to answer that question. So I don't think people should always feel like they need to be able to answer the question. And it was a really good learning point for me, because here at my organisation, we've got a massive redevelopment programme that we're trying to get approval for. I've never done a big redevelopment where I was. I've done lots of capital, but not a massive redevelopment of a hospital site. And some of the funding arrangements we were talking about, and how do we service this thing that we want to create, I had not delved in, and I just had to put my hand up and say, actually, I don't know about that. I need to go and find out. So I don't think people should feel actually the fact that they don't know, that's a criticism of them, because we can't know everything. At the end of the day, the reason we have hierarchies and structures is that we're hoping we've got enough talent and skill within our teams to help and support us to give those right decisions, isn't it? So the key thing for me, and I'll say this to anybody, I'm only as successful as the people that I employ who work for me and work for the organisation, because you are so reliant on your team. I was a team member and I wanted to do the best thing for my boss. If he had a question, I would go and find the answer to that and furnish him with the knowledge and the intel that he needed. So I think it's not bad to be vulnerable, actually. It shows you're human, and you can't have the answers to everything at the tips of your fingers. But the point is, you'll go away and try and find the answer. That's the right decision for the organisation, is the most important thing.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Jazz. And great question, Nicola. We have a similar one from Helen. Helen, if you want to also ask it, or if you want, I can ask on your behalf. But I think it leads on quite nicely, because it's still talking about when you're coming into senior level and adjusting to that. Helen,
Yeah,
there.
Hi. Yeah, hi. Hi, Jazz. Helen Alford. Yeah, similar leading on, I suppose. When you're moving into a new role at a senior level, and very senior level in your case, how long do you feel it takes you to have a good enough grip and understanding of your organisation and role before you can start thinking about making changes? And I suppose that, how do you stop yourself getting dragged into just doing things the way they've always been done in that organisation, because you start off not wanting to make changes too quickly, and then it's quite easy to end up, I think, sliding into a pattern that reflects the organisation you've moved to or the job you've moved to.
So again, a great question, Helen. I think you're right. There's always a time and a space, isn't it, to make a bit of an impact. And some people like to come in and implement change because they think that's the way they make their mark. I suppose I'm not that kind of personality. My DNA doesn't work like that. And I don't like to disrupt things just because I think actually I just need to change things and say Jazz has arrived and Jazz wants to do things differently. What I'm more interested in is, to your point, about at least understanding what is it that we have, what value is it adding, and that can take time. In the pandemic, like I said, for 2 years, that was nigh impossible because we were just all firefighting. But if it'd been a normal circumstance, I would have said in about 6 months, I would have probably taken grip and hold of understanding, and then tried to make sensible decisions about change. Now, the one thing I learned from one of my ex-managers was nothing is ever fixed, Jazz, is what she told me, because I think sometimes we get into this scenario where we think we can't change anything. I've talked to my finance team a number of times before who say, well, I can't change that because that's the way I do it. And I sort of say, well, why do we do it like that? And it's that lady's one comment that's made me always question, why do we do things the way we do them? And that's the question we have to ask of ourselves as finance people and of our teams, but also the wider organisation. I have no idea whether we run our orthopaedic department and services in the right way, but I always come to the table saying, now, ignore my ignorance, but why? And then people can, react to that, push back on it. But I think sometimes you have to ask the obvious questions in order to understand whether there is change due, and is that change going to be meaningful for our patients at the end of the day. So that, I suppose, I don't know if that answers your question, but I think it's about just judging what change you want to make. And there is, when I think about Imperial, there's 14,000, more than 14 now, 14,500 people that work at Imperial. Now, if you think about the brain power and the talent that sits in that 14,500 people, I won't have the answers to everything, they won't, but collectively together, if we can solve problems together, we'll get a far better outcome than any one individual trying to implement change because they think that's what they need to do. So I think it's very much a collective effort and keeping people on side, understanding what is the outcome we're looking for, because that's the reason we should make the change, not for any other reason. Is it about quality of care we're providing? Is it about financial sustainability? Is it about the environment sustainability that we as organisations want to grab hold of? Is it about the ethnicity and diversity of the organisation? Whatever it is that we're trying to improve, that's where you start your change journey and questioning what you're doing.
Thank you, it's great.
Does that answer your question?
I'll jump in here as well and ask Caroline the same question, if that's okay. Because I think when you started at RNOH, it was the first time you've been in the finance director role, but equally, I think this is quite useful to bring up a question like that in a situation like this. How soon do you start to make change in a new organisation, a new role?
I think Jazz has covered it, and you almost need to get to understand the systems and processes and get to understand the whys. And this is my fallback position. No decision is a bad one. At the time, the person who made the decision to do things that way did it. It was the best decision at the time. I can't see why anybody would do any different. If we all want the same thing, we assume that we all want the same thing. That is the success of the organization. At the time the decision was made, that was the best decision. So if we're going to change it, what's the reason why we're changing it? And it takes time, like Jazz said, it takes time and it takes bringing people along. And when I arrived here, I assessed the finance team, and it took me almost a year before I took a decision to reorganize the finance team. And it wasn't to take out posts, it was to put more staff in. I took a while because I wanted to bring them along. So what I did was, typically how I've seen it done is the finance director comes in and they have a plan and they put in these structures. I actually asked them, what do you think will work? You think your strengths, but what do you actually think will work? And then I asked the divisional colleagues, what do you want from your finance business partner? And I fed it back to them. I said, this is what they want. So what do we have to put in place to make sure we give them what they want. And that's bringing the whole organization. I think one of the divisional leads commented to me, this is the first time we've seen an organizational change management in the corporate service being shared with the whole organization. I just felt like I wanted input because they know this organization better than I do. And they know what works, and they know the terrain. If you see, a year in a job does not give you as much experience as somebody who's been here 6-7 years. Definitely not. And I respect that, and I draw on that, because as Jazz said, if we're pulling in the same direction, then we're going to get to our destination much quicker, won't we? Rather than me doing it for you. Yeah. And so when you bring a problem, you bring 3 possible solutions, and then we hash it out, and then we get to the conclusion.
Can I just interject, Caroline? Do you think in that scenario just played out, the fact that it was a joint decision with input and engagement from wider colleagues, everybody's vested in the success of that change, aren't they? Because they've been party to the conversation, party to the contribution. Whereas if you hadn't engaged with them, it very much would have been, well, you did it, Caroline, so you live with the consequence of that. So I think that's the important bit for me as well, is that, you know, everybody's got a shared vision about why it should be made a success. Absolutely.
Otherwise, people see it as you're doing it to them, rather than you doing it for them and with them. You know, there is no point me doing it for, because really, if you think about it, the finance director is that if I'm going to put posts in, you want to use the money we have is so scarce. You want to make sure you get the biggest return. So where do you think will make the biggest return? Where should we invest? And I said to them, remember, the organization is looking at us as finance colleagues. We hold them to account. They're going to hold us to account. So let's invest in the places where we can give a credible account of the return on investment. And that solves that problem for me. So I've solved the problem without having actually doing much. Other people take the decision for me. Yeah.
Yes, I always see corporate functions as we should have a service level agreement with our clinical divisions and other divisions, because it's about what do we bring that adds value, isn't it? And that's what you've tried to do through your engagement with colleagues in the wider organisation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Nicola, can I seize this moment and ask a question? I think, Jazz, and I've suffered with this, and perhaps I want to get your perspective on it. When do you know that you're good enough or ready for the next step? And I suspect I know what the answer is, but I thought I'd ask. It's a difficult question. I don't know that you, for me personally, I'd never know when I'm ready and when I'm good enough. But I don't know about you. It would be good to hear your perspective.
No, I think I'd absolutely chime with your sentiments there. And I think this is probably a lot to do with my culture, my career path, and how I've got to where I've got to, because a lot of that has a lot to do with it, actually. You know, if I reflect back, there was nobody in my family that had gone to university, so I was going to be the first one to go to university. I had no role models. You know, I didn't know how you planned your career and how you moved around, why networking was so important, you know. So I think I got to, before I became FD, to the seniority I got to just through sheer hard work. And I never knew whether I was ready or not ready. I just was given opportunities to be putting myself forward for roles, because like I said, it was the next step up and the next step up. So, you know, I was developing in that respect. And even, you know, having got to Imperial, did I know that I was good enough for Imperial? Probably not. I think for me, what reinforces things for me is when other people probably give me the confidence and tell me actually I'm good enough. And the wise words of a few people that say, you know you can do the job because you've been doing it. You know, you've got the technical skills. You don't get to be a finance director in an organisation without knowing finance. You know, that's just what it is. So then it's more about, so what more do you need? What's the little development piece that needs to take place as you move into a role like the one I'm in now? So I think, Caroline, without people probably prompting me, I don't think I would have probably gone for all those opportunities if I had my way. Because like I said, I had nobody to look to, I had nobody to go and have a conversation with outside of my work setting. So I very much relied on my colleagues in work to sort of sound things out. Well, they would say, well, why are you not going for that role? And I'd say, why should I go for that role? Well, you should absolutely be going for that role. You know what I mean? It takes somebody to sort of push you to say, go and do this. You know, why do you sit there all day not looking at these things as things that you could do? So I relied on that. And I think my learning from all of this is, as I came into roles where I was managing staff, I very much held on to that and said, I need to keep reminding people how good they are. And I need to give them the confidence that actually you can go for that role. A bit like you said right at the top of your story, that, you know, when you had the opportunity to go for a role, why would I stop somebody going for a role? I want to say to them, you're brilliant, you're great, go for it. It doesn't matter if it's in this organisation or another organisation. The point is, you should be looking to develop yourself, and I think you've got the right skills to do it. And sometimes those circumstances arise not because the organisation you're working in doesn't want you to stay, it just can't offer you what you are actually good at and potentially good at doing. So I think the best thing that we can do as managers is to spot talent, nurture it, and support people into moving into those other opportunities and reminding them of how good they are. So it's about things they can do, not the things they can't do. Because we're very good at focusing on the things we can't do. And I'm sure lots of people on this call probably know, you know, the research that says when you look at a job description as a female, I absolutely did this. I look at a job description and say, can't do that, can't do that, can't do that. And then that's it, can't do the job. Whereas you should absolutely be saying, I can do all of that. These are the things I need to learn about. Not because you can't do them, you just haven't had the exposure to them or the experience. So I suppose it's about testing ourselves in a slightly different way. But for me, it's always been about the people. Just like I spoke to you about opportunity and said, you know, could I do this? And you were very clear, Jazz, if you go to an acute setting and you go to an organisation like Imperial, it's like a bug. And you'll never want to come back to mental health and community because you just work in a very different way in an acute setting. And every day I get, you know, it's not easy. It's pretty challenging and we have things that we worry about every single day. But there's not been a day that I haven't got out of bed and said, I don't want to go to work.
You caught the bug, Jazz.
I got the bug, exactly. So, and that's not to say there's anything wrong with working in mental health and community, because every day I got up in that environment, I wanted to come and make a difference. So it's really about, why do you want to come to work? And if you find a role that it just inspires you to get up and come and do it, it doesn't matter if it's CFO, a senior manager or something else, that to me is a win-win every single day.
Great, thank you.
Do you want to explain or shall I continue?
Well, I was going to quickly ask about a couple of questions that came up earlier about around imposter syndrome, because it was ringing in with what Jazz was saying. Shall I progress along that way? Are you happy with that? And then we come back to that. So I think both Carol and Chanel both raised the point quite early on in the webinar today around imposter syndrome. Jazz, have you ever experienced it? And also, how does one tackle imposter syndrome after trying almost everything? So one is what's been your experience of this, but also what advice do you have based on what you've learned, what you've seen, and that other people here could benefit from?
So great questions. I don't know who asked them, but anyway, absolutely, imposter syndrome and resilience. I've suffered with it all my life. I didn't know it was called imposter syndrome until very late on in my career, because I had defined it as, I'm just not good enough. You know, I don't think I'm in the shoes of this role and doing the best I could be doing. So I always questioned my ability, and always questioned whether the organisation understood me, understood what I was bringing to the table. So I've always lived and breathed imposter syndrome. I've sat in board meetings and thought, should I really be here? Am I really the right person for this? I've sat at in the South East London patch. Is really interesting. When I first got my finance director role, I was the only female FD at the table in South East London. And I walked into this meeting and I had great allyship from my male colleagues, but they had been around the block a long time and they spoke the right language, they knew everything. And I would sit there and think, should I really be here? Can I really have a conversation in this environment? Can I really contribute in a way that people will listen to me? You know, because I was new. I hadn't been in those forums before, so there was a lot of just getting comfortable in my own skin about walking into that room, sitting down and thinking, I need to contribute, and almost, I suppose, getting myself out of my comfort zone, because it's easy to go to a meeting and just stay stum and not say a word, because you know what, that's probably sometimes safer than trying to say something. But actually, in an environment like that, you have to put yourself out, and you have to make a comment, you have to make a contribution. And I think the thing that really changed it for me was actually coming back, relaying my experience to my boss and saying, I've just been to this meeting. There was the likes of, and I'll name and shame them, Lorcan from Kings. I had Martin Shaw from GSTT. I had John Hennessy from Lucia from Greenwich. I was like, I had Gus from Slam. I was like, crikey, these are people that know what it's all about, and I know nothing compared to them. And I came back and said that, and I remember my boss saying to me, but Jazz, just listen to the conversation. What is it that they're saying that you think you can't say? And actually, when I replayed all of the things they had said in the room, it made me realise I could say stuff actually. And it's also great to sometimes be a bit controversial, maybe ask the obvious questions, because we've all forgotten about the obvious questions because we've been doing it for so long. So in a way, I suppose for me, the imposter syndrome bit was about saying, actually, what you need to do is be brave. And don't sit there meekly listening. You need to put yourself out there, and you do need to contribute. And if you don't, you will not get noticed at the end of the day. And that's to the detriment of your organisation and your patients, because you're in there fighting your corner for that population. And also trying to, I suppose, I think have the privilege of saying, although my organisation is small, I can probably lend more examples about things that we've done that, you know, sometimes in a very big organisation, they get lost because you can't put your arms around it, you know. And I think of Imperial, you know, we've got 4 big sites across a sprawling geography. We run our services out of 5 hospitals. How are you ever going to be able to get your arms around it and say that actually we can do things in a standardised way? Whereas in a small organisation, you've got good examples you can bring to the table and say, have we thought about this? So it's, for me, it was about finding things that I could contribute to in the conversation that was taking place. And I suppose just sometimes asking the obvious thing that maybe others had forgotten about. So that's how I would have said my imposter syndrome has started to slowly become more manageable, because I've got more comfortable with my skin and being able to speak in those environments.
That's fantastic. I was just going to point out as well, because I think Carol Cooper put her hand up during this, and the question initially came from Carol. So I just wanted to say, Carol, if you want to put your video on and ask a question. If you're still there. There she is.
Yeah, hi. Hi, Jazz.
Hi, Carol.
So I asked the question. Really appreciate your answer. And also, there are a couple of things that you said before that really resonated with me, because I come from a family where I was the first person to actually go into higher education. So going into the workplace and experiencing some of those things that you've spoken about, I found the same. It was very alien to me. And when you talk about imposter syndrome, one of the things that I have experienced that, one of the things I found really difficult was actually saying something and not feeling afraid that you'd made a mistake. So you always wanted to get something right. And I've had to really learn to manage that. So I found it really interesting when you spoke about your journey, because I feel that a lot of things that you just discussed or mentioned, I have similar experience to as well. So it's with, and also it's something that you have to learn to manage, because the more senior you becoming an organisation, you won't have all the right answers, but it's how do you actually work with giving your contribution. It may not always be accepted, but at least you've contributed.
Oh, thank you, Carol. It's really humbling to know that, you know, the experiences that I've been through, other people go through those things as well, because sometimes you can feel quite lonely. It's only you that's experiencing. And I know that's not true, but you just feel like that sometimes. I think the other thing I was just going to say about the resilience piece is when you move from organisation to organisation, like I have, from a small organisation to a big organisation, there are far more expectations of you in your role. I know Caroline would say the same thing, but a number of times people remind me I'm now the CFO of ICHT, Imperial College Healthcare Trust, and therefore I have a place in the world. Sometimes makes it more anxiety provoking, but on another level, I suppose it gives me the confidence to say the things that I think I need to say, because you know, it is a 1.4 billion organisation. There's no getting away from it. These are not small jobs, and we have to play the right role. So even just the organisation itself, I think, lends itself for you to actually get more comfortable with who you need to be. The new reinvention of Jazz is now the CFO of ICHT, not the finance director of Oxley's. And you have to view yourself in that environment a bit differently. But yeah, it takes courage. Absolutely takes courage, Carol.
Caroline, do you want to go for one last question and then?
Yes, absolutely. I think we're talking about resilience, aren't we? So therefore, I wanted to ask, what was the biggest adjustment from getting, and you've touched on some of this, from going from mental health to acute? You talked about how different it is. What have you found challenging? What kind of support has worked for you? So I'll say it again. What's the biggest adjustment from going from mental health to acute, different sectors? What have you found challenging, and what kind of support worked for you? If you've used any support, I suspect you might have done. Not that I know anything.
So yeah, I suppose I've touched on a few of those things already, Caroline, but I suppose the biggest challenge for me was actually learning about the organisation and what it provides and what it does. I mean, it's something very basic, you know, just the funding regime in an acute organisation was not something that I had delved in. I knew about it, but I hadn't really done anything with it, because in my world, it was all block contracts, and, you know, I understood them, how they operated. And you know, I was just comfortable with that way of working. In this organisation, when you've got, you know, millions coming in for research, the importance of research and innovation, the payment by results mechanism when it was around back in the day, well, that's all changing now, and just understanding how we accounted for the finances of the organisation, and where the money sat and what we were doing with it. I think that for me was one of the biggest challenges. So although technically I'm an accountant and I understand all of that, it did take me actually quite a bit of time to sit on my own, look at information, read it, understand it, more so than just the interview process of looking at board papers and things, but really trying to understand how we're reporting financial performance in this organisation, so that when people were talking to me in a language that may have felt a bit alien, I needed to make sure that I understood it, or ask all the right questions about it. So I think that would probably be, although it sounds a bit perverse, one of the challenges I would have put in, was just trying to understand the regime itself. Obviously, the pandemic helped a bit because we moved into a block arrangement, and all of a sudden I understood it, even though, you know, I didn't need to learn about it anymore. Again, the other challenge for me was, I think, making sure that I got around and was able to speak to all of my exec colleagues, because I didn't know them. I didn't know how we ran the business, how the divisional structures worked, what the challenges they faced day to day. To your point, were we adding value as a finance function? Were we supporting them in making the right decisions? So I think that legwork was also one of the biggest challenges, but I knew that would be a challenge and I wanted to get on top of it. I was actually hungry to learn about the organisation, and for me that was going to be part of my success, actually, for my own personal way, to say I've done that, I've understood it. I now know that when I make a comment, support a decision or challenge a decision, I'm doing it from the right point, thinking about the right outcome, rather than a point of naivety. So I did have to invest a lot of time on my own to try and make sure that I could do that quicker than possible, probably in the pandemic. In terms of support, I would say I've got probably 2 or 3 people I normally pick the phone up to, have a conversation about, share some of my dilemmas, and I look to them as a sounding board, really, to say, what would you do in this situation? Because I'm really struggling with, how do I make sure that my contribution is the right contribution, and the decision we're making is the right decision. And I don't come across as the big bad finance person who's only worried about the money, bottom right hand number, and doesn't care about the patients, doesn't care about quality. So, and I think I found that really helpful about how I frame what I say in meetings. And I always start from the point of, if we put the money to one side, is this the right decision for the organisation? Let's think about the outcome we're trying to achieve, and then think about, so what's the financial consequence of that decision? Because I don't want the money to be leading the decision. I want to be the right decision, and then we tackle, okay, so if that's the decision we want to make, how are we going to square the money off? And there are trade-offs that we have to go through in those scenarios. But I think it's good to have people that you can go and have a conversation with and just tease things out, because things are never straightforward. There are some very difficult decisions to make. As you said, resources are scarce. The NHS has had a good 2 years in terms of finance regime, I would say, not because of services, because obviously we've had some devastating events take place, but the money has not been a blocker to decisions. But we are now moving into a world where finance is going to be a focus again, and we need to bring everybody back onto that page. That it's not something we can ignore, but how are we going to tackle that efficiency, productivity agenda that we all have? So I don't know if that answers your question, but those would be the two things around challenge and support.
It's really inspiring to hear that. I mean, having people around you. I mean, one of the things I took from what you just said is the importance of having a sounding board and having people around you, and therefore networks are quite important, aren't they? Because you need to be able to have somebody that you can talk to about anything and trust that they'll give you a good response, or a considered response, or actually just talk it through with you, even if they don't give you the answer at the end, talk it through with you, and that's invaluable. So that's helpful to hear.
I just want to add one thing, Caroline. Sorry to talk over you, and this is so important, and I should have said it right at the beginning. The relationship with my chief executive is the one thing that has to be absolutely tight. Somebody once said to me, she'd not be able to get a piece of paper between a chief exec and a CFO, because I think if you don't have your chief exec support, and they're not there to listen and guide and support and help the decision making from a money perspective as well as everything else, that to me is not a combination or a relationship that's going to foster the right thing in any trust. So I think for anybody on this call that's looking to make those moves, make sure that the people you're going to work to and work with are absolutely the people that you can work with, because those relationships are absolutely fundamental to your own resilience, your challenges and how you face them, and the support networks that you need when things get difficult, because you need to be able to draw on those pretty quickly and do the thing that you need to do. So sorry, I should have said that right at the beginning.
No, that's so important, Jazz. And I think I visited RNOH about 4 times before I decided I wanted to come and work here. And I met the chief executive, I think 2 or 3 times. So at the end, he was probably fed up with me, but I wanted to be sure that I wasn't going from a place where I was very comfortable to a place where I'm going to be absolutely miserable, because we spend an inordinate amount of time at work, don't we? We might think we spend more time at home, but actually half of that time is sleeping. But our work is where the business happens, and you need to have good relationships, not just with the chief executive, your executive colleagues as well, and feel welcome and feel like you otherwise it's going to be a miserable life, and you don't want that. So thank you for that. That's really helpful. I'll hand over to Nicola.
Thank you, ladies, and thanks for that. Particularly the last couple of questions. There's some really good tips and advice that have come out, and so I'll just do a bit of a summary and download before we close down. We can stay on for another 10 or 15 minutes or so, but I think there's a few people that need to dash off. So I think there was loads there that came through on today's session, and thank you so much, Jazz and Caroline, for being so open. A couple of the pieces that resonated with me was what you were saying about really getting to know the organisation, to get out there, meet the services, meet the patients, meet your exec colleagues, and really get back to what it's all about and why we do this job in the first place. equally to be clear of what you bring to the party, Jazz, as you said, authentic leadership, never blag it. If that's not your style, just be you. And also about the imposter syndrome, that crazy thing that raises its head again and again. Be brave, ask the obvious questions, contribute, even if you think what you're saying might sound daft. You know, who's not said something like that in an interview, and after a while it doesn't sound daft anymore. And also give that back, so give others confidence to go for the roles in the way that you've had someone give you that confidence. So just to sum up, it has gone really quickly today and we've covered loads of ground, so thank you for that. I want to say a couple of thanks, particularly to Jazz and to Caroline for co-hosting and obviously for being our speaker, Jazz. We will be running a repeated recording of this session on the 3rd of May, which is Tuesday next week at 12 o'clock. So if any of your colleagues missed it or wanted to see it, or you want to recommend it on to people, then just let me know and they can email me their details and I'll send the link. The next session, just to make you aware, is the 3rd in our series of resilience during transition, and that will be on the 18th of May at 5 p.m. featuring yet another impressive woman. Her name is Geeta Trevero-Seymour of a company called High Definition U. Now, Geeta was recommended to us by one of our network, Amy Sweeney, and this session will be on, guess what, imposter syndrome. So it's probably the most common phrase that's come up on every webinar that we have had. And it will be an interactive session. So Geeta is really inspiring. She's like a sort of mindset coach. So she'll be deconstructing imposter syndrome and talking about some helpful things that we can do to work around it. And I can't promise everyone will become really confident after it, but definitely come along and see how it goes. We will be using the breakout room function, so there'll be the chance to network as well. Thank you to everyone for joining today. I've got some favours to ask. Please recommend this network to others that you know, your colleagues, your team, your boss, etc. Remember, it's not just for women, even though Women in Leadership for Finance. Please email me or Zoe if you have any feedback and let me know if you have any ideas for future sessions, future speakers. Our content is constantly shaped by the network of those that are within it. So it's important that we keep that evolving. Also, I can recommend tomorrow there's the Cultural Diversity Network webinar. That's taking place tomorrow at 2 p.m. That was also set up by the East of England, is focused on diversity and inclusion. And tomorrow's theme is tackling health inequalities with Sanjay Agrawal. So if you want to join that, email, send an email to cultural.diversitymatters@nhs.net. cultural.diversitymatters@nhs.net, or email me or Simon Mendy or Don Richards and we can forward you the link. So Caroline, Jazz and I will be staying on for another 10 minutes or so. If you want to stay, you're more than welcome for a bit more chat. Otherwise, thank you again for attending today and look forward to seeing you on the 18th of May.